Welcome to Peak, Train Like a Girl, a podcast by girls in sport, for girls and coaches in sport. We're here to amplify your voice. It deserves to be heard. At Peak, we are a safe place for girls to hang out, learn, grow, and build community. We empower girls in sport and coaches with knowledge, resources, and support we think is necessary to thrive in today's environment. Join us for bold conversation about the experience of girls in sport. Our discussions will make you laugh, cry, cheer, for sure get frustrated, and hopefully rethink the future of girls in sport for generations to come. So whether you're walking, commuting, home from break, baking Christmas cookies, or in your bedroom, take us with you. Follow us. It helps more than you can imagine. Check out our website and make sure you share with a female athlete or coach you love. Now, I'm so excited to introduce our last guest of our first season in 2024. I think it's super fitting that Melissa from the Fed Collaborative is on to talk to us today. She's someone who I have been admiring, following, and learning from for the past year. Her information and content on Instagram is not only thorough, but it's super digestible, which is something I have found really important for me. It helps me bring accurate information to the athletes that I coach. And I can't wait for you to learn a little bit more about her and everything that she's doing for girls in sport. So Melissa, are you ready to get warmed up?
I am. Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Okay. Cat or dog?
Dog.
Nice. Track workout or long run?
Oof, it's probably changing at this point in my life, but I'd say up until now, track workout.
Nice. 4-star hotel or camping?
Oh, if I'm being honest, 4-star hotel. Camping sounds fun, but
I love it. We're all about being honest. How about camping with a good shower?
yes, that I'm into.
I love it. Okay, road trip or plane?
Plane.
All right.
Yeah.
You're quick, right?
Yeah.
And let somebody else worry about the details.
Exactly.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for being here. What I'd love for you to do is get us introduced to you. Let us know your story of how you became involved or interested in girls in sport. You can go back as far as you want, but we want to hear a little bit about you.
Yeah, of course. So I'm an interdisciplinary health science PhD candidate. Most of my research focuses on the female athletes, particularly under conditions of low energy availability and relative energy deficiency in sport, REDS, which we'll probably chat about today. But really, that kind of goes back to me growing up in sport. I tried a bunch of different sports. I was really interested in just like playing and being active, and came from an active family. So it was really just ingrained into my life as early as I can remember. I really took to soccer, as a lot of runners kind of do when they're younger. And my sisters ran in high school and college. So when I got to, they're older than me. So when I got to that stage, I eventually started to make the switch more so primarily to running. And it was really at that time in myself, in my teammates, and my competitors that I really started to be exposed to some of these concepts around fueling and training, and how, during puberty, females' bodies are changing, and whether or not that was, my friends that were doing sports or just other girls in my class, like, it became more prominent. And so I would say that that's kind of the first time that I remember being exposed to some of these issues or concerns, if we want to call them that. And I was always really interested in helping contribute to solving those concerns. And I just never really knew, what that would look like. When I went to college, I was running for my school and trying to figure out what the heck I wanted to do with my life, as I'm sure many, high schoolers or college students would relate to. And I really thought I wanted to be more so on like the clinical side of the picture. But as I was even getting treated for certain injuries and conditions, due to fueling, I really realized that there was so little information. And while I had great physicians and like wonderful practitioners taking care of me who were well versed and well knowledgeable, but yeah, I was exposed to for the first time to how little information we really had on female athletes. And I found that to be quite an interesting approach to answering some questions that I didn't really know was available at the time. So I started to think maybe I could contribute in this way. Maybe I could help answer questions that we don't have the answers to, because that's not only going to help me as an athlete, but that could help young girls in sport. That could help my teammates. That could help my coaches to be able to really support the health and well-being, but also performance of the female athlete. So it's kind of a really abbreviated way of saying like how I've gotten here to be more on the research and teaching side of things. But yeah, I have a really strong emphasis on trying to answer questions that female athletes and female athlete support staff have so that we can make sure that we're supporting them across the lifespan.
Yeah, that is amazing. And I love that you circled around clinicians have a role, but so do researchers. And in order for clinicians, and that would be whether it's a psychiatrist or a nutritionist or a personal trainer like me or a physical therapist, without data and research, it's really hard to come up with a plan. So the value and importance finding the information, I think, is so kind of underestimated or understood. Maybe you can explain to the people listening why the research specifically for women is either non-existent or inaccurate. Can you help fill us in there?
Yeah. So, well, it does just go back, I would say, to female athlete participation in sport. We know that they were left out of participation for a long time. And so while we're seeing this boom of female athletes competing across all levels, we still see that the research has not quite kept up with this. And some of that can make sense in a way. Research tends to not lag behind, but it takes longer. So in order to get these recommendations into practice, there is a bit of time that has to elapse between those two things. But at this rate, we can confidently say that the participation is not being the participation of women in sport is not being reflected in sport and exercise research. So luckily we see, like, especially at the collegiate level with Title IX, there's about equal representation. This past Olympics in 2024 was the first gender balanced Olympics that we'd had. And so we're making strides there. And when we look at the research on females in sport and exercise science, we see that they really make up only 34% of research participants. And then if we zoom in a little bit further on that looks like 6% of studies were conducted in female only populations. And I call attention to that just because there's a benefit to having males and females in a research study. But when we're looking at what we call female specific concerns, things around birth control or the menstrual cycle, we're really demonstrating a lack of evidence or support to base our recommendations off of, to understand how to make sense of females responding to training or responding to fueling. And so a lot of these recommendations that we see, whether it's from training or coaching or sports nutrition, they're just based on the male body. My first question as a researcher, and I think we should all kind of take this approach regardless of, what framework we come from, is not necessarily that it needs to be different, but we first need to find out, do the recommendations need to be different? And then if so, how? So we really need to answer those questions in order to better support female athletes, because if we're basing all of our recommendations off of the male athlete and applying that to the female body, and we're not meant to, well, then we're not only leaving, time and seconds or, however you quantify performance in your particular sport, but we could potentially be sacrificing, their health and well-being as a result. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to go back to the statistic you talked about where specifically the athletes in the Olympics, was it equal? Was that what it was this time? Equal?
Yeah, it was considered gender balanced.
Gender balanced.
And
okay.
so basically the men and women competing had equal opportunity in participation across all of the events. So, if we dig in a little bit here, there's still some considerations around, for example, track and field. We have a multi-event discipline called the heptathlon or the decathlon. Yep. Now, the women compete in 7 events and the men compete in 10. And people have called question to that of, so in that circumstance, it's gender balanced, but it wouldn't necessarily be considered, exactly 1-for-1 equal because the women are competing in 7 events, whereas the men 10. So I believe that that's probably the best way to, or a good analogy as to why it's explained as gender balanced versus, equal participation.
Sure. Yeah. But what I'm wondering is, even though that's becoming quote unquote more balanced or equal, whatever word you want to use, what isn't becoming more balanced or equal is the amount of representation specifically for coaches. So like we know that 80% of high school, college and high school coaches are men. Mm-hmm. So 95% of all men's teams are coached by men. So 95%, 42% of women's teams are coached by women. So my question is one of the reasons the information is behind is because the people in charge are still men.
Yeah, it's a really correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. It's
sorry about that.
No, don't apologize. I think that that's an interesting question that my scientific brain is thinking, well, I guess we don't actually know, but there is more information coming out about female athletes' preferences.
Yep.
And whether or not that is to have a male coach or a female coach, or whether or not we should be considering that you just had some really illustrative stats here that females are more likely to coach female teams, but also why are we not considering that female coaches can coach athletes as well?
Exactly.
Yeah, but it does call into question some of the attitudes and beliefs around not only coaching, but what that means to coach female bodies. And I'm very interested in making sure that we are educating all of our coaches. So some of the concern that we have around male versus female coaches is maybe the comfortability or awareness around female specific problems. And so while it does absolutely help to have a female on staff who can help address those concerns, is we also really want to make sure that we're addressing that underlying issue, which is that there's not enough awareness, that there might not be enough understanding from a male. It could not just be that they don't want to ask. It might be that coaches don't know what questions to ask. And so I want to make sure that we're bringing everyone into that conversation. And that way we can make sure that females are feeling supported, because they should be comfortable to approach a male or a female coach related to any issues that they might face. It's we try to bring down the temperature of well, you wouldn't not tell your male coach that your knee hurts. So if you're having an issue about anything related to the female body, that should be something that we should feel quite comfortable communicating. You know, one of my tips for like young athletes, especially who might feel uncomfortable bridging that gap, like to give you an example, like I was super comfortable talking about this stuff from a young age because I was the youngest of five. I had four sisters and they had the same high school coach that I had. And so I was like, oh, whatever. He's heard this stuff before.
Sure.
And I just didn't mind. Like I was quite, comfortable having those conversations. But when I talk to young athletes, I know that's not always the case. And so usually what I try to tell them is, well, just talk about the symptoms.
Yeah.
Talk about, you don't have to say that you are on your period, or you don't have to say that you're having this complication because it could be related to something due to your female body. Why don't you just say, I'm having cramps?
Yeah.
Why don't you just say that you're experiencing some low back pain? Cause really what the research suggests is that we don't have to, at this point, from what we know, which is still not a lot, is we don't have to adjust training based on menstrual cycle phases.
Right.
But that's not to say that we ignore it entirely.
Yep.
What we should do is address the individual and their symptoms and how they're presenting on that day, which is really what I would typically just call good coaching, right? It's like,
right, exactly.
If you show up to practice and your knee hurts and you might not know why, or you might have an idea as to why, and you have a coach that's, I don't care, go run your repeats anyways. Well, that's probably just not a great coach in general. And so if you have that same, if you apply that same principle here to a young girl who might be going through body changes or, has a symptom related to her period that's making her uncomfortable at training that day. Well, if we can address the symptom, that would go a long way for her feeling more comfortable in training and being able to compete to the best of her ability. But by and large, if a coach isn't going to be addressing individuals' concerns, that's going to be a red flag regardless of whether or not it's related to female physiology or something else.
Yeah, I agree. And so while we're talking about periods, let's go ahead and finish the conversation. I know that you have done some research around gender bias around menstrual cycles, so not only again about missed opportunity, and I think that you and I are both in agreement there. We're talking about missed opportunity from a performance perspective, but then we're also talking about long-term health and well-being. It's hard to get a 16-year-old or even a 20-year-old to hone in on the fact that what they're doing today is going to have long-term implications. And I get that. So I like that we can talk about both. We can talk about missed opportunity and we can talk about long-term health. So what's some of the information you're finding around gender bias and menstrual cycles?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I don't know if I would necessarily say that this is a gender issue again. I mean, gender in the sense that the females are going to experience this. But as far as like beliefs from a coaching perspective, there's some really interesting findings that have come out about how specifically coaches respond to menstrual dysfunction, which I think ties in here to the health and the long-term health implications that stem as a result of not getting a normal menstrual cycle. But there's a couple studies here that show over 50% of coaches had some awareness that amenorrhea, which is a particular form of menstrual dysfunction, was an undesirable consequence of engaging in high intensity or high volume training. But less than 20% of them discussed issues related to menstrual function. And 19 to 42% of coaches express little concern towards the associated health implications that may result from menstrual dysfunction. So thinking about like bone health and long-term implications regarding osteoporosis, even though we also know that there's some performance implications as well. So I think that I 100% agree with you. We have a really hard time conveying to female athletes, especially young female athletes, that they need to care about their 70-year-old body when they're in their 17-year-old body.
Yeah.
And I think that we still need to do a lot of work there.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we also need to do a lot of work with the coaches, because the
Agree.
coach really, they're not the ones that are going to have the consequence when they're 70 years old as a result of their female athlete
Yeah.
potentially losing their menstrual cycle. So we need to do some education there, and I don't even know, like, it's almost more than education. It's, the empathy and the
That's
respect
exactly right.
and
Yes.
the care. Like, athletes entrust a lot in their coach. And
Yeah.
so to express little concern for the long-term health consequences it's really disconcerting, because that's, they're going to spend more time in their non-athletic self
Yeah.
than they are their athletic self.
Agreed.
And so, and again, like, it's really hard to convey that to a 17-year-old whose brain's not fully developed, who's really focused on their performance, who's not really thinking long term about what their life's going to look like. But a coach who has some, level of ability to see the big picture, right?
Yeah.
Like, whether or not they're in their care for that long is one thing, but they have at least some understanding of how that could impact their athletes across the lifespan. So I think we need to, be really mindful about how coaches are playing a role in the long term, as well as the immediate short term that they're, trying to get the athletes to perform.
Agreed. And I don't know, part of it for me is, I think, just seeing it firsthand. I mean, even, the extreme is having to hospitalize an athlete, right? So, I mean, I've seen that. You coach cross country long enough, and I mean, you see it. I mean, just it.
For sure.
And I think that maybe a bigger piece for me is because of disordered eating, underfueling, over exercising. Osteosporosis and osteopenia is part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And 61 years old, and I'm, and I do all the right, quote unquote, things, right? I'm of normal body size. I move, I lift weights, but, years and years and years of abuse. And that is what it is, right? It is abuse to your body. It took its toll. And even at 60, I have 30 years left on this planet, and I want to be able to move, and I want to be able to get around. And, you're right. Even if you stop your competitive career at 40, because athletes are performing, much longer, 40, you still have half your life on this planet, like, if not more. And so I think that's a big part of it. And I definitely want Megan to chime in here for a second. Before we do that, I think one of the problems is we misunderstand a lot of verbiage and words, and we misuse them. Like, people don't understand that they use fitness and they equate fitness to how somebody looks, as opposed to fitness being a measurement of, your VO2 max, or how, like, that is fitness. And then people confuse what health is. Health is cardiac health numbers, or even bone density numbers. Like, you could look at me and everyone thinks like I'm the picture of health. I'm not. My bones are literally deteriorating. I mean, so part of it to me is that we as a culture and a society have equated those words with how somebody looks, as opposed to really looking at and understanding that those words are about numbers. They are not about a look. Do you think that I'm overstating that, or what are your thoughts?
No, I don't think you are overstating that. I think that that's really insightful, and something I see a lot in sports, and even like outside of sport. I think young people tend to gravitate towards, how people look, and we've shifted language over time, but it hasn't actually gotten away from this idea of like, oh, we used to think that thin was a compliment. Now we think that fit is a compliment. And now we used to not describe foods as, or we used to describe foods as good and bad. And now people use healthy and unhealthy. And it's evolved, but it's really just, it's what you're saying of like focusing on the external rather than the internal, because it's obviously much more difficult to get access to the data on the inside. But I would say that we should really work on the messaging there, because not only can athletes internalize what that means, but it's not very reflective of, like you said, what's happening on the inside, which is definitely more of a reflection of how healthy somebody is, and yeah, what that can mean in the short term and the long term.
Yeah. I guess that's what's confusing to me about the periods. And I do want Megan to weigh in here, but, and maybe you can help me with this. I think the thing that's confusing to me is that when you're looking at gender differences, the one thing girls have going for them, which can be a measure of health, is if they are menstruating. So to me, like, that's the easiest thing to start tracking, is that, and that's, that is an easy way to see what's going on inside. So I guess, to me, why aren't we using such an easy tool? I mean, why are we not talking about that when it's literally so easy?
Yes, I agree. I think the most interesting thing is that there are so many obvious pointers that we still are not using, because when I'm at practice, weekly, and we're talking about recovery and nutrition, it's the same thing that I think it's never been changed. It's, stretch, drink enough water, foam roll. It's the same basic things where, this could be super helpful and actually a lot more accurate, because I really, really agree with the internal versus external, because I mean, for us specifically, we're in swimsuits year round. So obviously you looking a certain way has really no, relation to how you're feeling on the inside, because as we've all seen, that doesn't really correlate or relate super well. So I agree. There's very obvious tools that we can be using that are just simple questions. And going back to what you said before, which I found, so I just had never thought about that way, is that you wouldn't go to practice and continue practicing if your knee was really bothering you.
Well, that was great. I agree.
And I've never thought about that way before.
Me either.
So yes, I agree very much.
Yeah, that was pretty spot on. Melissa, what are your kind of thoughts around that? Like, just changing some of the things that we as coaches and athletes and teams are, setting, like, we're having the basic conversations around, quote unquote, nutrition and hydration and menstruating.
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I think the way that I describe it is kind of have to lower the temperature on these topics. Like, they're quite weighty and heavy. And like I said, they can be uncomfortable and sometimes triggering for athletes. And so if we can lower the temperature and just make it part of our everyday language, just as you would talk about hydrating or foam rolling, I think that would go a long way. I do think we have to be particularly careful, unfortunately, in the landscape of our, political system and otherwise, about how we actually ask these questions. And so my best advice, particularly for coaches, is open the door and let the athlete walk through. And that can be things like, make sure that you put this in your log today, or don't forget to say how training went, and practical tips for why we are not doing a good job of getting athletes to track these things is simply because I think there's actually too many options that it's hard to sift through, like what to do, where to go. There's a lot of different period tracking apps. Some are meant for athletes, some are not meant for athletes.
Correct.
And it's just one more thing to do. And I know it sounds silly because, I should be convincing people to do this, but I totally get why they don't and why it's actually a really hard sell. And so I try to make it as easy as possible. Like in my world, a lot of people will record their training and write down their runs, what they did that day. If other teams do that, how can you incorporate that into your training log? If you just start with your period, at least we've got some basis. And there's ways to stack on top of this, but like, can you put a dot on the day next to your training that you have your period? There we have at least your period, the start of your period. We've had the bleeding days, because you'll put a circle next to every training day that you've had your period. And then there's like ways to really chew it.
Yeah.
The symptoms, relevant training notes, like whether or not it impacted your training that day or you had to adjust something because of symptoms. And then really the thing that people, I think, you don't learn or you don't appreciate until you've started to do this practice is the only way that we can make tracking effective or worthwhile is to go back and look at what has happened previously. And so this can be really helpful if something goes awry and now you're experiencing some sort of menstrual dysfunction. Now you have a basis to say, well, I was regular for this amount of time, and now I've noticed that there's an increase in the number of days between bleeding, or I've gone a month without, and so on and so forth. But really, even if nothing does go wrong, you can look and say, oh, you know what? I actually tend to do quite well on the first day of my period.
Exactly.
And now that's empowering. Or, you know what? I didn't have a horrible workout after all. It's really just, it's the end of my luteal phase and I don't tend to feel quite good. And what you feel is going to be different than your teammate or your competitor or what your coach is telling you should feel like. And so it can really help establish personal trends and then help you determine what strategies can be useful to help either alleviate those symptoms or just mentally reframe and check in with yourself that, oh, you know, how many times I'm sure athletes listening will relate to the feeling of like spiraling after a bad workout or a bad game or competition where you're just like, that didn't feel like me. You feel out of touch with yourself. And then you start to go down this rabbit hole that you might not have any business going down in the first place because, oh, really, maybe you just don't perform well on this day. And that's a particularly challenging day because there's a lot of symptoms that crop up and like in 2 days time, you'll be feeling much more like yourself and, you know, your training and performance will be just fine. And so like, we want to make sure that we're not putting too much stock in things that don't need our time and attention, which is really hard to do when you don't have anything to base that off of, and you can't go back and look at those trends and look at those strategies that have made you feel better in the past. So
yeah, I think that's really good. So this year, so Megan knows this, during the parent meeting, I put out a survey at the beginning of the season, and it's general information. What sports were you doing? Like, what's your favorite mode of communication? Whatever. And one of the things we did on there this year, and parents got we said that we are going to have a question on there about periods. If you're not comfortable with your athletes filling this out, you know, that's totally cool. If you're not comfortable with us, I mean, like, we really kind of had an easy conversation around it. Every single athlete on the team and their parent filled it out, which was really interesting. And it just wasn't a big deal. It was on the same form that everything else was on, and just kind of normalizing the conversation around it. But the interesting thing is that more conversations were like, oh yeah, they would say I'm having really bad period cramps, or I have to inevitably, I'm bleeding really heavy. You know, can I turn around for my run? I feel like something's going to happen. Like, that to me was really refreshing because it also took a lot of their discomfort away. It took a lot of ambiguity away from a coaching perspective. So just kind of, you know, using the word, we didn't have those conversations with every kid and we didn't have them every day. But my point is that they were there and I thought that was really good. I had coffee with a former athlete the other day who is now a Division I athlete. I don't want to give too much information because I did not tell her I was going to be talking about this. But she said she did, throughout the first semester, did lose her period. And she said that because of the podcast that she'd been listening to different things, she just knew that wasn't something that was going to be in her benefit for the long haul from a health and wellness perspective. And so she went to her coaches and said, listen, this is what's happening. This is not normal for me. And then went and got blood work done. But so my point is that just having the information doesn't mean it's going to be this constant topic of conversation, but it means that when something isn't right, people know that they need to go find the right resources. And I think that's the place I want to get to.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that questionnaire that you gave the athletes and parents is a really great example of what that can look like to open the door to conversation and to give athletes permission to talk about these things. I think it's like such a small act, but now athletes are, oh, my coach is tuned in. They care about these issues. And then the example that you gave with that college athlete is, now I know that this isn't normal. And if I have a conversation about, oh yeah, this is just, like what's happening with me normally, and now something goes wrong, well, the door is open, the conversation is started, and now there's better resource and quicker, like a quicker timeline to identification and getting into if treatment's required for whatever reason. Like, and we know that those things are really important with these issues, especially with the menstrual cycle, where typically, like you had alluded to earlier, it's the presence of the period is visual. It's feedback that you get regularly. But if you don't get on top of those issues, it can really get away from us, because we're all, what I tell athletes is another reason to track is because we're basically always a month behind. And so as soon as you lose it, you've gone a month without it. And so now we're kind of playing catch up in a sense. And then if there's, implications of disordered eating or underfueling, and there needs to be some psychological support, we know that earlier intervention leads to better outcomes. So the sooner that we can identify these things and have these conversations, the better off the athlete is at getting treatment that's, successful or timely. And that obviously is going to help their health and performance.
Yeah, we may have to have you on again. But there are two other things I do want to talk about before we start to cool down. So REDS, capital R, capital E, capital D, small s. So relative energy deficiency in sports. So that is the correct. Maybe just, can you give like a really simple, like, you're talking to a bunch of middle school and high school athletes and their coaches. What's a really simple way to understand REDS?
Yeah. Do you know that this is not my strong suit? Is how can I make this something simple?
I know. I'm so sorry.
I'm so long-winded. No, it's not you. It's good for me to work on. So you got it right. You spelt it right. You got all the things. Relative energy deficiency in sport. If I were to simplify it, it's a syndrome of impaired physiological and or psychological functioning that's experienced by female or male athletes due to an exposure to low energy availability, which then low energy availability is simply a mismatch between your energy intake and your exercise energy expenditure. So what you're taking in, fueling, and what you're putting out in training. And there's a fancy equation that, bases this off of an athlete's fat-free mass. But really, if we're making it simple, it's, you are burning more than you are taking in, or you're not even burning more, but you're burning so much that all the energy that you're taking in is going towards that and leaving your body's energy needs unmet. So you can't meet things like, you can't provide enough energy to support your immune function, to support your reproductive function, to build up your bone. So that's why when we talk about some of these consequences, is when we talk about the health implications, it's basically because all of the energy that you need for training needs to be met, because you're putting your body through that stress and demand. So it's going to provide you the energy to support your exercise and training. But that means that you still need this energy for all of the things that are, unseen or not appreciated, because your body typically just does them without you really contributing much. And so we see the body system start to shut down because it's trying to preserve your life, really.
Yeah.
And so we see the health implications as a result. And then, of course, if we're not fueling enough and it's impacting our training, then we start to see some performance consequences as well.
But not always right away, right? I do want to make that clear. Some people
Yes.
can perform the way through it, right?
Yeah. And we're learning more. It's really in its infancy in our understanding about why we see it affect athletes in different ways. But essentially, we see that the exposure to low energy availability can vary in its duration, magnitude, and severity. So that could play a role in why we see it differently in athletes. But some athletes' body systems respond differently to exposures of low energy availability. And so we might see that some athletes never lose their period, although quite common for athletes to lose their period if they're underfueling. We might see that it takes longer for an athlete to have a bone stress injury as a result of underfueling, where some athletes' bone is quite responsive to those fluxes and energy intake. So we are learning more, but as of right now, I would agree with that sentiment of like, it doesn't affect everyone the same way, and it doesn't affect everyone's body systems equally. So that's really important, that we can't rely on certain metrics
Right.
all of the time, like a decrease or a drop in performance. Sometimes people can continue to improve or stagnate or, decline in performance. So,
right.
Yeah.
But just because someone's not, or because someone still performs optimally, doesn't mean that they're not long-term health consequences. That's the point I wanted to kind of circle back to. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. I've got one more question. And then just because I think it's important for people to understand, can you help, again, young athletes, coaches, caretakers understand that a lot of times we see athletes being treated, I'm using air quotes, for missed menstrual cycles or not, not consistent menstrual cycles, being put on the birth control pill. And then all of a sudden they're quote unquote menstruating. Can you help people understand why this is not an actual menstruation and not a sign of optimal health?
Yes. So this was a recommendation at one point in time. It's outdated. We no longer recommend that athletes who are experiencing menstrual dysfunction, particularly due to low energy availability in REDS, are prescribed the hormonal birth control pill. This is for a couple reasons. One, it's actually not protective for bone. So originally what people thought was estrogen is protective for bone. When there's a state of underfueling and menstrual dysfunction as a result, there's low estrogen. And so we start to see that bone turns over and we actually lose more than we gain, which is why we see a decrease in bone mineral density. But oral contraceptive pills provide estrogen. They also provide things like progesterone. But they thought originally that would be positive for an athlete's bone. It has not been shown actually over time to be that effective in improving an athlete's bone health. So that's one of the reasons why it's recommended. Another reason is because it actually masks the menstrual cycle. Yeah. And so you might experience what we call a withdrawal bleed on a oral contraceptive pill, where you take those, what they're called like the sugar pills or the OC free taking days. And so it mirrors what looks like a typical menstrual cycle, which is, I wish it just didn't, because it confuses a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so if you experience a bleed on an oral contraceptive pill, it is your withdrawal bleed. It is not a period. So we mask the ability to detect whether or not menstrual function has resolved as a result of nutritional or training changes. Instead, what could be recommended for an athlete not on oral contraceptive pills, for an athlete that's experiencing low energy availability or REDS, is a transdermal 17-beta estradiol patch with cyclic oral progesterone. This has been.
You may have to text that to me.
I will. Yeah, we can put that in like the notes or something. It is. Yeah, it's a mouthful. I get it. But this has been shown to improve bone mineral density, and it doesn't mask the regular menstrual cycle. So an athlete could, and this is not recommended long term by any means, but it's basically in the interim, especially with our adolescent and young adult athletes who are still able to build bone mass. We meet our peak bone mass accrual around our early 20s for female athletes. And so if they're in that window of opportunity, we basically want to fend off against any losses. And you can see it almost as like a band-aid where we provide this in the interim while we're increasing energy intake to support training load. And this will allow us to detect whether or not the menstrual function or, our reproductive system has responded to an increase in energy availability while still protecting our bone. If an athlete, this is, I want to add this caveat too.
Okay.
Sorry, I know we're going long, but this is important to consider as well because young athletes might be looking towards birth control as an option for contraception. We do know that there's actually a couple of reasons why people will reach for contraceptives, and it's not only contraception, but that is one of the primary uses, obviously, as the name suggests. But if you have an individual who might not be, experiencing low energy availability or REDS at the moment, but has a history of it or a history of eating disordered eating, where there might be some implications for a non-hormonal birth control option that will still allow them to detect changes in their menstrual cycle that could be related to fueling. Now, obviously, athletes should talk to their OBGYN for an individualized birth control plan, but I like to say to athletes that by no means am I saying that you shouldn't choose the option that's most convenient, most appropriate for you. But we do need to be mindful that we lose the menstrual cycle or the period specifically as a marker of health as it pertains to REDS. Yeah. And so there are some non-hormonal birth control options that athletes can look towards. And that's a whole nother can of worms about, how birth control can relate to symptomology and training and performance. But yeah, I would say, long story short, oral contraceptive pills are not recommended to quote unquote treat REDS. And there are some options to help protect the bone while making those changes to training or fueling that can help support the long-term health and performance of that athlete.
Super helpful. Megan, before we get cooled down, do you have anything you want to ask or add? This was there's so much, I can't wait to listen to it again.
I was seriously just thinking that I have heard so many different types of analogies and information that there are so many things checking in my brain now that I will be re-listening to this as well.
Yeah. Megan and I do the podcast for our own benefit, not for anybody else's. It's hilarious. All right, Melissa, let's get a little cooled down here. I think we're only have time for one question. So I think it's going to be a really important one because I'm super interested. If talent were not an issue, which sport would you like to excel in?
Oof. What a good question. There's probably a couple of them, but I would say soccer. Soccer is so fun. I was only good at running up and down the field, which is why I switched to running. So if the talent was there, I would have stuck with it. It just it's so fun to watch. It's so dynamic. I would say if I had to pick, I would go for soccer.
Love it. That's so awesome. Yeah, I have several clients who are playing soccer in college, and it is excited to watch them online now, which is the modern technology. It is a fun sport to watch. That is for sure. And obviously coaching cross country, I see a lot of girls who get cut from the soccer team inevitably and end up running, but it is so funny, right? Cause they can run up and down the field, but the hand-eye stuff is sometimes a little different than some of the other kids. So thank you so much for being here, Melissa. Thank you for being our last guest in our 2024 season, actually our first season hosting our podcast. We can't wait to come back at you next year with a whole new list of guests. Hopefully Melissa will come back Don't forget to follow us, share our episodes, join us on Instagram, Peak Train Like a Girl, and make sure you also follow Melissa. We'll make sure we leave all of the details in the show notes at Fed Collaborative. So much information in there.